The music died first. Not with a final, elegant note, but choked off. A wounded sound strangled by a meaty hand clamping down on the violin's strings. Arthur Vance felt the vibration cease against his jawbone. The sudden, jarring silence a physical blow. The afternoon sun, a warmth he could only feel, did nothing to chase the chill that snaked up his spine. He stood perfectly still, his sightless eyes facing the brick wall that served as his stage. The smell of exhaust fumes and stale hot dogs, the usual backdrop to his days, was suddenly sharp, acrid with a new tension. "Well, well?" a voice sneered, thick with cheap liquor and unearned confidence. "Look what we got here. The blind maestro." Laughter followed, coarse and jagged. Arthur could picture them. He'd learned to see with his ears, painting portraits from the cadence of footsteps, the texture of a voice, the small, unconscious sounds people made. These were heavy men, their boots scuffing the pavement with lazy arrogance. There were 3 of them. Marco, the one who spoke, always led. His voice was a rasp, his laugh a bark. The other 2 were echoes, their chuckles following a beat behind, eager and hollow. "Playing for pennies, old man?" Marco continued, his voice closer now. Arthur felt a puff of stale air against his cheek. "What's the tune today? Something sad to make the ladies cry and drop $1 in your little box." Arthur's violin case lay open at his feet, its worn velvet lining holding a meager collection of coins and a few crumpled bills. He didn't respond. His silence was not weakness. It was a wall he had built long ago, brick by painstaking brick, a fortress against a world that had taken too much. His knuckles were white where he gripped the neck of his violin, his only anchor. The instrument was an extension of him, a vessel for the memories and emotions he could no longer see in photographs or faces. It was the last gift from his wife, Eleanor, before she was taken by a sickness that moved as swiftly and mercilessly as the shrapnel that had stolen his sight. A shoe nudged the case, sending coins skittering across the concrete. The sound was like glass shattering in the quiet cathedral of Arthur's mind. The small crowd that had been listening, a mother with a stroller, a pair of office workers on their lunch break, a few tourists, began to disperse. Their footsteps quickened, a shuffle of collective avoidance. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to be a witness. Their indifference was a familiar ache, a dull throb that accompanied the sharper pain of the thug's cruelty. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Marco growled, his impatience rising. He poked Arthur's shoulder. The touch was a violation, a breach of the small, sacred space Arthur carved out for himself each day on this grimy patch of sidewalk. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too good to talk to us?" Arthur took a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of grit and fear. He could feel the city's pulse around him, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing subway train, the hurried conversations of people with places to be. He was a ghost in the machine, a silent statue that played beautiful, heartbreaking music no one truly heard. Today he was not even that. He was sport. He lowered his violin, holding it protectively against his chest. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet but steady, a low, resonant hum against the city's noise. "I have nothing you want." The simplicity of the statement seemed to infuriate Marco. It offered no fear to feed on, no anger to match. It was just a fact. Marco's laugh was sharp, a crack of thunder with no rain. "Oh, I think you do," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than his shout. "You got our attention, and now you're going to play us a private concert." He leaned in again, the smell of onions and sweat overwhelming. "Play something happy, or we'll see if this pretty little fiddle can fly." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The remaining onlookers, those trapped in the orbit of the confrontation, stared at their phones, at the cracks in the pavement, at anything but the blind man being cornered against a wall. Their silence was a verdict, a judgment that his dignity was not worth their intervention. For Arthur, the world had gone dark years ago, but this was a different kind of blindness, a willful refusal to see, and it felt infinitely colder. The pressure was immense, a physical weight pressing down on him. But beneath it, a core of unyielding strength held firm, forged in a crucible of fire and loss he never spoke of. This was just another battlefront, and retreat was not in his nature. The conflict was a slow, deliberate strangulation of the air around Arthur. Marco and his two shadows, whose names Arthur never bothered to learn, formed a tight semicircle, cutting him off from the flow of the indifferent city. They were a wall of cheap cologne and menace. Marco, emboldened by the lack of resistance from the public, decided to escalate his theater of cruelty. He reached down and plucked a dollar bill from the violin case, holding it up between two grimy fingers. $1, he announced to the silent audience of the street. For a song about a blind man who can't see what a joke he is, the other two thugs snickered. Their amusement accrued harmony to Marco's lead. Arthur remained motionless, his face a mask of placid endurance. He could feel the vibrations of their movements through the soles of his worn shoes. He knew their positions, their weight shifts, their growing impatience. Inside him, a storm raged. It was not a storm of fear, but of a deep, weary anger. He had faced down men with guns in dusty, sun-scorched landscapes. He had held dying friends in his arms, their last breaths whispering promises to families they would never see again. He had learned to navigate a world of perpetual darkness, relearning everything from how to pour a cup of coffee to how to feel the shape of a loved one's face in his memory. This casual, pointless cruelty from men who mistook his stillness for weakness was an insult to every battle he had ever won. "I'm not a joke," Arthur said, his voice still low, but now laced with a filament of steel. It was not a plea. It was a correction. The statement caught Marco off guard. He had expected begging, or tears, or a trembling rendition of some sad song. He had not expected dignity. It was like a foreign language he couldn't comprehend, and it angered him. "What did you say?" he snarled, stepping closer until his chest almost touched Arthur's violin. "You think you're better than us? Sitting here with your hand out, playing your sad little songs." He gestured expansively to the street. "Look around, old man." "Oh wait, you can't." The laughter was louder this time, more vicious. "Nobody cares about you. You're just a piece of scenery. Something to walk past on the way to a real life." To prove his point, Marco turned to a businessman who had paused, his briefcase held like a shield. "Hey you!" Marco yelled. "You gonna give the blind guy a standing ovation? Or are you gonna mind your own business?" The man flinched, his eyes darting away from Arthur's face. He gave a slight, apologetic shake of his head and hurried away, his footsteps a rapid, shameful retreat. The act solidified Marco's power. He had demonstrated that the social contract was broken here on this corner. He was in charge. He turned back to Arthur, a triumphant smirk in his voice. "See? Nobody's on your side. So play. Play Pop Goes the Weasel or something stupid. Make us laugh." He snapped his fingers impatiently. Arthur's mind drifted for a second, away from the grimy sidewalk. He remembered the weight of his rifle, the camaraderie of his unit, the feeling of purpose that came with shared sacrifice. He remembered the explosion. Not the sound, but the sudden, violent pressure, a fist of pure force that slammed the light out of the world forever. He remembered waking up in a hospital bed, the world a cacophony of disembodied voices and the terrifying, permanent blackness behind his eyelids. He had thought his life was over. It was Eleanor who had brought him back. She had placed this very violin in his hands, guiding his fingers onto the strings. "Your ears are your eyes now, my love," she had whispered, her voice a balm on his raw soul. "Let them see the music." He played for her. He always played for her. And he would not debase her memory, her gift, with a performance born of fear for men like Marco. He would not let them turn her love into a punchline. He tightened his grip on the violin, its smooth, aged with a familiar comfort. He would not play for them. He would not give them the satisfaction. The silence stretched, each second a victory. Arthur's resolve was not born in a vacuum. It was the hardened product of a life that had systematically stripped everything away from him, leaving only the essential core of his character. He was a man built from the wreckage of his own past. He rarely thought of Sergeant Vance, the man he used to be. That man lived in a world of light and color, of clear objectives and a chain of command. He had led a platoon in a dusty, forgotten corner of the world where the sun beat down with a physical weight and the nights were filled with an unnerving silence that was worse than the noise of battle. He remembered the grit of sand in his teeth, the smell of cordite, the heavy comfort of his body armor. He remembered Private Miller, a kid from Ohio, barely 19, who carried a worn photograph of his high school sweetheart and talked incessantly about the porch swing he was going to build for her when he got home. Miller had been on point during that last patrol. Arthur had seen the glint of metal in the dirt a split second too late. His shouted warning was swallowed by the roar of the IED. The blast had thrown him backwards, a rag doll in a storm of fire and shrapnel. His last sight on this earth was of Miller's body being flung into the air, a silhouette against a white-hot flash. He had woken up to darkness, the searing pain behind his eyes a distant second to the guilt that clawed at his soul. He had failed to save the kid. That failure was a ghost that walked with him every day. His recovery had been a long, brutal climb out of a pit of despair. The world was a terrifying maze of unseen obstacles. Every sound was a potential threat. The familiar landscape of his own home became a hostile territory. It was Eleanor who had been his guide, his light in the unending darkness. She had a laugh that could fill a room and a patience that seemed infinite. She never treated him like he was broken. She taught him to trust his other senses, to find a new kind of beauty in the world. She described sunsets to him with such vivid detail that he could almost see the colors blooming behind his eyelids. "The sky is on fire, Arthur," she would say, her hand in his. "All orange and purple, like a bruised peach." She bought him the violin on their 5th anniversary after his injury. He had protested, feeling clumsy and useless, but she insisted. She guided his fingers, her touch gentle but firm. "You always had music in you," she told him. "This is just a new way to let it out." The first sounds he made were screeching and awful, but she never flinched. She just smiled and encouraged him. And slowly, painstakingly, he learned. The violin became his voice. Through it, he could express the grief, the rage, the love, and the profound sadness that words could not touch. He played the memory of Miller's hopeful smile. He played the color of Eleanor's favorite dress. He played the agony of her loss when cancer took her 2 years later, a quiet, insidious enemy he couldn't fight. Now, standing on this sidewalk, he was no longer Sergeant Vance, leader of men. He was not even Arthur Vance, beloved husband. He was just a blind musician, a fixture of the urban landscape. But the principles that had guided the sergeant remained. You do not surrender your position. You do not show fear to the enemy. You protect what is sacred. And this violin, this music, was sacred. It was all he had left of Eleanor, of the man he once was, and of the fragile peace he had built for himself in the dark. Marco and his thugs were not soldiers. They were not a bomb in the sand. But they were an assault on that peace, an attack on the last bastion of his dignity. And so he held his ground, his back straight, his chin up. He would not play their tune. He would endure their noise, and when they were gone, he would play his own song, a lament for all that was lost, and a hymn for all that had endured. The pressure from them was external, but the strength he drew upon was internal, deep, and unbreakable. The tension on the corner had drawn a larger, yet still more silent, crowd. People slowed their pace, their curiosity warring with their instinct for self-preservation. They watched from a safe distance, their faces a mixture of pity, fear, and a strange, detached interest, as if watching a scene from a movie. The world had become a gallery of spectators. Marco, feeding off their passive attention, grew bolder. He saw their silence not as disapproval of his actions, but as tacit permission. He was the main event and Arthur was his prop. "Last chance, Grandpa," Marco spat, his patience worn thin. He jabbed a finger toward the violin. "Play, or I'll smash this piece of firewood into splinters." The threat was real. Arthur could hear the shift in Marco's weight, the coiled energy of a man about to commit an act of mindless violence. The violin in his hands felt impossibly fragile. It was just wood and string and varnish, but it held the entire world he had left. The thought of it being destroyed, of its voice being silenced forever, was a physical pain, a sharp, cold dread that pierced through his calm facade. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of his breathing. He had to do something, but what? He was outnumbered, outmatched, and blind. At that moment, a small sound cut through the tense standoff. It was the sound of a child's sob. A little girl, no older than 5, stood a few feet away with her mother. In her distress at the scene, she had dropped her ice cream cone. It lay splattered on the sidewalk, a sad pink puddle. Her cry was not loud, but it was pure, unadulterated heartbreak, the kind only a child can produce over a small, world-ending tragedy. The mother, a young woman with tired eyes and a frayed coat, tried to quiet her. "It's okay, honey, it's okay," she whispered, her voice strained with embarrassment and stress. She shot a fearful glance at Marco, then at the ground, wishing the concrete would swallow her and her crying child. Marco and his friends turned toward the sound and roared with laughter. "Ah, look at that," Marco jeered. "The kids crying over spilt milk. Or, ice cream." Their laughter was a fresh wave of ugliness, directed now at the vulnerable mother and child. It was a tipping point. The cruelty was no longer just about Arthur. It was spilling over, poisoning the air for everyone. Arthur heard it all. The child's grief, the mother's shame, the thug's derision. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. His own predicament, his own safety became secondary. The sergeant in him, the man who was supposed to protect the innocent, resurfaced. He could not fight these men with his fists. He could not intimidate them with a show of force. But he could perform one small act of defiance. One small act of kindness in the face of their hate. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt down. It was an act of immense trust, exposing his back to his tormentors. He set his precious violin carefully on the pavement beside him. His hands, which knew the contents of his case by touch, swept across the worn velvet. He gathered all the coins and the few crumpled bills, his earnings for the day, maybe $12 or $13 in total. It was his food money for the next 2 days. Without a word, he shuffled on his knees toward the sound of the child's crying. The crowd murmured. Marco and his men fell silent, confused by this unexpected turn. Arthur's hand reached out, holding the small pile of money. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft but clear, projecting through the sudden quiet. The young mother looked down at the blind man kneeling before her, offering his entire livelihood. Her eyes filled with tears. I can't," she stammered. "A song is worthless if there are tears in the audience," Arthur said, his voice imbued with a simple, profound authority. "Please, buy her another one, a big one." 2 scoops, he pressed the money into her hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers. His face was calm, serene, showing no trace of the sacrifice he had just made. He had taken their mockery, their threats, and their cruelty, and transformed it into an act of selfless generosity. He had refused to play their game of intimidation and had started a new one, a game whose rules they did not understand. He had chosen to protect a stranger's dignity over his own pride and safety. He remained on his knees for a moment, a silent, humble figure in the center of the hostile street, his empty violin case a testament to his choice. The act was so simple, so unexpected, that it fundamentally altered the atmosphere on the sidewalk. It was a quiet detonation of grace in a space filled with ugly noise. The thugs were momentarily stunned into silence. This was not in their script. They dealt in fear and intimidation, currencies that Arthur had just refused to trade in. His kneeling was not an act of submission to them, but an act of service to someone else. It was a power move they couldn't comprehend. The young mother stood frozen, the crumpled bills and heavy coins a warm, impossible weight in her palm. She looked from the money to Arthur's face, his sightless eyes aimed in her direction, and then at her daughter, who had stopped crying and was now watching the blind man with wide, curious eyes. Tears streamed down the mother's face, but they were no longer tears of shame or fear. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude and awe. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around her daughter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It was a sound meant only for Arthur, but it resonated across the silent street. Then the shift began. It started with a single person, an older man in a tweed jacket, who had been watching from the doorway of a bakery, stepped forward. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and walked over to Arthur's empty violin case. He didn't drop it in. He folded it neatly and placed it gently on the velvet lining, a gesture of profound respect. He nodded once at Arthur, who could not see it, and then stepped back. His action broke the spell of communal paralysis. A woman in a business suit, who had been speaking angrily into her phone, ended her call. She opened her purse, her expression softening, and added a $10 bill to the case. A construction worker, covered in dust, ambled over and dropped a handful of change that clattered like applause in the quiet. One by one, the silent onlookers, the people who had tried so hard to be invisible, stepped forward. They were no longer just a crowd. They were becoming a community, united by a shared moment of witness. The whispers started. "Did you see that? He gave her everything he had, those bastards." The tone was no longer one of fear, but of indignation on Arthur's behalf, and a burgeoning, fierce respect for him. They looked at Marco and his thugs with new eyes. The bullies no longer seemed powerful. They looked small, brutish, and pathetic in the face of Arthur's quiet nobility. Marco felt the change instantly. The power dynamic had been inverted. The audience was no longer his. He had lost control of the narrative. His face flushed with a mixture of confusion and rage. He had come here for a power trip, to feel big by making someone else feel small, and somehow this blind old man had turned the tables on him without raising his voice or his fist. "What is this, a charity show?" Marco bellowed, trying to reclaim his dominance with volume. "He's playing you all for fools." But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. It sounded hollow, defensive. His two cronies shuffled their feet, looking uneasy. They glanced at the growing number of people adding money to the case, at the hard, disapproving stares being leveled at them. The sport was over. This was something else entirely, something they were not equipped to handle. Arthur remained on the ground for a moment longer before slowly rising to his feet. He picked up his violin, his movements unhurried and dignified. He didn't acknowledge the money piling up in his case. That wasn't the point. He had made his stand. He had chosen kindness over conflict, and in doing so had exposed the thug's cruelty for the hollow, pathetic thing it was. He turned his face toward the warmth of the sun, his expression unreadable, and waited. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt a profound sense of peace. He had been true to himself and to Eleanor's memory. In the sudden, respectful silence of the city street, that was a victory more valuable than any amount of money. The city was still watching, but now they were watching with him, not just at him. Just as the quiet respect on the street began to solidify, a new sound intruded. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration felt more than heard, like the precursor to an earthquake. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that seemed to be coming from all directions at once. Heads turned, searching for the source. The sound was not a siren or a truck. It was something more primal, more deliberate. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day. The rumble resolved itself into the unmistakable staccato roar of V-twin engines. One, then two, then a dozen motorcycles turned the corner onto the street, their chrome glittering in the afternoon sun. They were Harleys, big, loud, and unapologetic. They moved with the slow, menacing grace of a predator pack. At their head rode a man of immense size, his long gray hair tied back in a ponytail, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. On the back of his leather vest, The iconic, feared emblem of the Hells Angels was displayed proudly. He was followed by a phalanx of bikers, their vests or cuts, a uniform of leather and patches that told stories of allegiance, territory, and brotherhood. They didn't just ride down the street, they claimed it. Traffic slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether. The bikers filled the road from curb to curb, a rolling blockade of steel and leather. The crowd of onlookers, which had felt so brave moments before, shrank back, their newfound courage evaporating in the face of this new, far more intimidating force. Marco and his thugs froze, their faces paling. This was a different league of trouble, a world away from bullying a blind man. The lead rider, the one they called Wreck, brought his bike to a halt directly in front of them, the engine idling with a ground-shaking thump-thump-thump. He swung a massive leg over the seat and dismounted. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders as wide as a doorway. His eyes, narrowed and cold, swept over the scene, taking in every detail. Marco's blustering posture, the fear on the faces of his cronies, the respectful pile of money in the open violin case, and finally Arthur, standing calm and still by the brick wall. As Rex stood there, more and more bikes continued to pour onto the street, and the one behind it and the one behind that. The initial dozen was now 50, then 100. They came from every direction, a coordinated, overwhelming arrival. The air thickened with the smell of hot metal, exhaust, and worn leather. The sound was deafening, a physical presence that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. 150 Hells Angels, a sea of them, shutting down the entire city block. They dismounted in near silence, their movements economical and purposeful. They formed a vast, silent perimeter, a circle of intimidating guardians with Arthur at its very center. Marco, trying to salvage a shred of bravado, stammered, "Hey man, we ain't got no problem here. We were just leaving." Rek ignored him completely. His focus was entirely on Arthur. He walked forward, his heavy boots sounding like hammers on the pavement. The crowd held its collective breath. Rek stopped a few feet from Arthur. For a long moment, the two men stood in the eye of the storm, the massive biker and the blind musician. The contrast was stark, yet there was an unspoken connection that seemed to hang in the air between them. "Arthur Vance," Rek said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, but devoid of the menace he had shown Marco. It was a statement, not a question. Arthur tilted his head slightly, a gesture of listening. He could not see the patch, the bike, or the man's immense size. He only heard the voice. "Do I know you?" he asked, his own voice steady. "You don't," Rek replied, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "But I know you. You served with the 101st. 2nd Battalion, Kandahar Province." The specificity of the information sent a ripple of shock through those close enough to hear. This was not a random encounter. Rek took another step closer, his voice dropping so only Arthur could hear him clearly. "You were Sergeant Vance. My brother was in your platoon. Private Daniel Danny Miller." The name struck Arthur like a physical blow. Danny Miller, the kid from Ohio, the porch swing, the last thing he ever saw, the ghost he carried every single day. The violin nearly slipped from his grasp. His calm exterior finally cracked, a fissure of old, raw pain breaking through. All these years he had carried that burden alone. Now, here, on a city sidewalk, his past had roared up to meet him on 150 Harley-Davidsons. The brotherhood he had lost in the desert had been replaced by another, one he never knew existed, and they had come because of him. The reveal hung in the air, charged with years of unspoken grief and gratitude. Rek's words, Private Daniel Danny Miller, had unlocked a history that Arthur had kept buried deep within himself. The faces in the crowd, those who were close enough to hear, registered shock, then dawning comprehension. This wasn't just a blind street musician. This was a soldier, a hero. Rek saw the flicker of pain on Arthur's face, the way his knuckles whitened on the neck of his violin. He turned his attention back to Marco, and now his voice was no longer quiet. It was a roar that cut through the idling engines, a public proclamation for all to hear. This man, Rec boomed, pointing a thick finger at Arthur. This man you've been tormenting for your cheap laughs. His name is Sergeant Arthur Vance. He took a step toward Marco, who involuntarily stumbled backward. My little brother, Danny, was just a kid, scared out of his mind, 1,000,000 miles from home. He wrote me letters. He told me about his sergeant, a man who looked out for the younger soldiers, who taught them how to stay alive. A man who treated them like his own sons. Rec's gaze swept over the silent, watching faces of the community, then over his own leather-clad brothers, who stood like stone sentinels. On their last patrol, my brother stepped on an IED. The only reason they ever found enough of him to send home for a proper burial was because Sergeant Vance here threw his own body over him. He tried to shield him from the blast. He turned his piercing eyes back to Arthur, and for the first time, a raw emotion cracked his gravelly voice. The explosion took my brother's life, and it took this man's eyes. He traded his sight, his light, trying to save a 19-year-old kid from Ohio. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The story, delivered with such raw, personal force, recontextualized everything. The quiet, dignified musician was suddenly seen in a new light, a halo of sacrifice and forgotten heroism. The shabby coat, the worn shoes, the sightless eyes. They were no longer symbols of pity, but the uniform of a man who had paid an unimaginable price. The act of giving his last few dollars to a crying child was no longer just a kind gesture. It was a continuation of a lifetime of selfless service. Marco and his thugs were paralyzed, their earlier arrogance replaced by a primal, sickening fear. They were not just facing a biker gang. They were facing the living embodiment of a code of honor they could never understand. They had desecrated a sacred space, insulted a man who was, in this world of leather and steel, a saint. Rec took another slow, deliberate step toward Marco. We, the Hell's Angels, have a code, he said, his voice dropping back to a menacing growl. We respect warriors. We honor sacrifice. And we do not, under any circumstances, tolerate disrespect shown to a man like this. He gestured to Arthur. This man is under our protection. This corner is under our protection. This city block is now his, and ours to watch over. He didn't need to make a physical threat. The implication was absolute, backed by the silent, unblinking stares of 150 battle-hardened men. The message was clear: your time here is done. Forever. Marco swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. He and his friends turned, practically tripping over their own feet as they scrambled to get away, melting into the crowd that parted for them with expressions of utter contempt. They vanished, their brief, ugly reign of terror extinguished completely. With the thugs gone, Rec turned back to Arthur. The hardness in his face dissolved, replaced by a look of profound, sorrowful respect. He told me in his last letter, Sergeant, Rec said, his voice thick. He said if anything happened to him, I should find you, and I should thank you for trying. It's taken me a long time to find you. I'm sorry it took so long. Arthur finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. He was a good kid, Danny. A good soldier. It was all he could manage. But it was enough. It was an absolution, a shared acknowledgement of a loss that had shaped both their lives in profound ways. The ghost that Arthur had carried alone for so long was finally being seen, and in that, it felt a little lighter. The truth of his past, a story he would never have told himself, had been brought into the light, and it had set him free. The street corner was transformed. It was no longer a place of commerce or transit. It had become a sanctuary, a stage for an act of profound recognition. The departure of the thugs left a vacuum that was quickly filled not with noise, but with a powerful, resonant silence. The engines of the 150 motorcycles idled, a low, constant hum that was both a promise of protection and a guard of honor. Rec looked at the violin in Arthur's hands, then at the case overflowing with money offered by the shamed and inspired community. He knew Arthur would never accept it. Men like Arthur didn't operate on a currency of pity or charity. Respect was the only coin that mattered. Rek nodded to one of his brothers, a burly man with a guitar case strapped to his back. The man unslung it, opened it, and pulled out a worn acoustic guitar. He strummed a simple, mournful chord in A minor. Another biker, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, produced a harmonica from his vest pocket and blew a low, bluesy note that hung in the air like smoke. The music started there, simple and raw. It wasn't a performance. It was an offering. It was the only language they had to properly articulate the honor they felt. Rek looked at Arthur. "Sergeant," he said, his voice gentle, "would you do us the honor?" Arthur stood for a moment, absorbing the sounds around him. The rumbling engines, the tentative notes of the guitar, the lonely cry of the harmonica. He could feel the collective presence of the bikers, a solid wall of loyalty at his back. He could feel the respectful gaze of the community, no longer seeing a victim, but a pillar of strength. He had been so alone for so long, and now he was surrounded. He lifted the violin, Eleanor's gift, and settled it under his chin. For years he had played for himself, for his memories, for the ghosts of his past. Now he would play for the living. He would play for the brother of the boy he couldn't save. He would play for the brotherhood that had found him in the darkness. He drew the bow across the strings, and a note emerged, so pure and clear it seemed to silence the entire city. It was a note of sorrow, of loss, and of pain, but underneath it, for the first time in a long, long time, there was a current of hope. He began to play a slow, haunting melody, an old folk ballad full of longing and resilience. The biker with the guitar found the key, his chords providing a simple, sturdy foundation. The harmonica player weaved in and out of the melody, his notes bending with a raw, bluesy emotion. It was a strange orchestra, a classical violin, a folk guitar, a blues harmonica, all backed by the rhythmic percussion of idling Harley engines. But it worked. The music they created was something entirely new, a fusion of grief and grit, of elegance and raw power. The community watched, mesmerized. The mother and her little girl were still there, the girl now holding a new, 2-scoop ice cream cone, watching the impromptu concert with wide, innocent eyes. The shopkeepers had come out of their stores. The office workers had forgotten about their deadlines. They were all part of it now. Some began to clap softly in time with the music, a gentle, rhythmic pulse. One by one, other bikers joined in. Not all of them were musicians, but they found ways to contribute. Some tapped rhythms on their gas tanks. Some stomped their heavy boots on the asphalt. They became a choir, a percussion section, a living, breathing testament to the man in their center. They were playing beside him, with him, for him. Rek didn't play. He stood guard, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring that nothing and no one would ever interrupt Arthur's music again. He reached into his own vest and pulled something out. It was a patch, but not a Hell's Angels insignia. It was simpler. It was a custom-made patch that read, "Vance's Corner, protected property." He walked over to the open violin case, and with a reverence that bordered on holy, he gently placed the patch on the worn velvet lining, right in the center of all the money. It was a symbol, a deed to this small piece of the world, a declaration that this ground was now hallowed. Arthur Vance was no longer homeless or a fixture. He had a home and an army to defend it. The sun began to set, casting long shadows down the street and bathing the scene in a warm, golden light. The sky, which Arthur could not see, was surely on fire, a blaze of orange and purple, like a bruised peach. But he could feel its warmth on his face. The music swelled, a powerful, emotional crescendo that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone present. It was a song of redemption, not just for Arthur, but for a community that had remembered how to see, and for a brotherhood that had found a warrior to honor. The last note of the song hung in the air, vibrating with all the unsaid emotions of the day, before finally fading into the rumble of the engines. For a moment, there was a profound and reverent silence. Then the applause started. It wasn't the polite clapping of a concert hall. It was a roar, a heartfelt, thunderous ovation from the community, from the bikers, from the entire city block that had become a witness to this quiet miracle. Arthur lowered his violin, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of release. He turned his face toward the sound of Rek's voice. Rek placed a heavy, gentle hand on Arthur's shoulder. "You'll never have to play alone again, Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We got your back," he turned to his brothers. "All right, boys, let's give the man some peace." There was no grand ceremony. The bikers began to move with the same quiet efficiency with which they had arrived. They swung their legs over their bikes, the leather creaking. One by one, the engines revved, a staggered, rolling thunder that was not a threat, but a salute. Rek gave Arthur's shoulder a final, firm squeeze before mounting his own bike. He was the last to leave. He looked at Arthur one more time, a long, respectful gaze, then turned his machine and roared off into the twilight, leading his brothers away. The community began to disperse slowly, quietly. Their faces changed. They looked at Arthur with a respect and awe that was palpable. He was no longer just a part of the scenery. He was a landmark. The young mother came forward, her daughter holding her hand. She said nothing, but placed a single perfect rose into his violin case, next to the patch. It was a gesture of pure, unadorned gratitude. Arthur was left alone on the corner, but he was not lonely. The air still vibrated with the phantom roar of the engines. The smell of leather and exhaust lingered like incense. He could feel the warmth of the setting sun on his skin and the weight of the rose in his case. He reached down and his fingers found the patch Rek had left. He traced the embroidered letters. Vance's corner. He smiled. A true, genuine smile that reached his sightless eyes. He did not pack up. He did not count the money he would not keep. He simply lifted his violin one last time. As the final sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, he began to play again. It was not a sad song, nor a triumphant one. It was a piece by Bach, intricate, peaceful, and full of a quiet, resilient grace. He played for Eleanor, for Danny Miller, and for the unlikely brotherhood that had found him in the dark. The music flowed out into the twilight, a solitary, beautiful voice on a corner that was now, and forever, his. The distant rumble of motorcycles was the last thing he heard before his own music filled the world, a final, lingering image of dignity found, and of a respect that had been earned not with violence or words, but with a single, selfless act and the enduring power of a song.